Drivers testing examiners. What is the worst mistake a new driver has made on a test? I was the new driver. At the time, I read about a new law where drivers could run a stop sign if the driver could see that the intersection was clear. This was considered a rolling stop. I went to my test, drove a stick, fluently, rolled through a four-way stop. The instructor freaked. That was a four-way stop. Now, there's a new law to save gas. You're allowed to roll through a stop if the intersection is clear. It was passed in October. It was clear, so I rolled through. Satisfied, the instructor scribbled something on his clipboard. And I passed. I went back to work, told the guys about the dumb instructor that didn't know about the new rolling stop law. They said, "That's not a law. They proposed it in October, and it got shot down. I can't believe he passed you." Well, hey, if you already know how to drive, I don't think it matters that you cheated a little bit on your test. Not an examiner, but had a driving class in high school that went out in groups to drive. One kid didn't know how to turn off a turn signal. He didn't know that you can flick it off with your hand. After he made a turn, the signal was still on, so he began wildly jerking the wheel left and right, trying to make it stop. Well, as we all know, if the thing just keeps clicking, it's just going to be so annoying that you're going to want to get into an accident anyway. Driving instructor told me about a previous student who drove directly over a very large mound of grass-type roundabout. Apparently the examiner wouldn't even let them drive back to the test center. Took over driving for them. Roundabout? Never heard of it. I'm just going to go straight through this. Not the examiner, but I was involved. I was driving my regular vehicle into the parking lot of a CDL, only driver facility to renew my CDL. As I'm making a right into the lot from the public road, a semi-tractor trailer comes flying out of the parking lot into my right-of-way. I avoid by pulling off into the grass. The trailer continues onto the road but crosses directly across into the parking lot opposite. I get off the grass, park properly, grab my things, and walk into the facility. I was right pissed off, but I wasn't hit, so I wasn't going to go after the guy and cause a fight. About 3 minutes later, a driver examiner walks in screaming about this idiot who is never getting his Class A, as long as she lives. And whoever brought him here better not ever let him try again, and needs to go across the street to collect the vehicle and the sorry excuse for a driver. Yeah, nearly got taken out by a newbie truck driver. I wonder if he ever did pass, or if she truly was able to permaban him. Man, for the first half of this story, I was expecting that they would think that he was the bad driver and then he would get banned when it wasn't even his fault. Not me, but my driving instructor said a student failed when they forgot to put the car in drive. Did pretty much everything else, but they were pressing on the gas and were confused as to why they weren't moving. You know that before you even get to try driving on the road, you have to go through a whole classroom session where they teach you all of the fundamentals first. So I don't know how exactly they missed the part where they teach you how to actually turn the car on. My dad was an examiner for a while. Once, a girl froze during the test and stopped on railroad tracks and a train was coming. Not real fast, but fast enough that it might not have been able to stop. She would not hit the accelerator as she was frozen in fear, especially after the train blew its horn right into the window. My dad had to put his foot over to her side and hit the gas to get off the tracks. See, I never really understand people like this who, once they get under pressure, they just completely shut down, they don't know how to do anything. Like, maybe you need to get your mental state under control before you try something dangerous. Not an examiner. I passed the test first time, 100%, although when driving back into the car park of the transport department, I pulled in a little wonky, so I said, "Oh, I'll fix that for you." I reversed back to straighten up. Another car started to pull out directly behind me, not noticing me, I guess, and they were about to hit my car, so I stressed out and put the car in drive to move forward quickly, a little too quickly, and launched my car over the car space barrier thing. I wanted to cry then and there. He just said, "Okay, I'll meet you inside." I parked the car and sat there for a good minute, knowing that must have made me fail. As I walked inside, I saw all the instructors standing together with him, and they were all laughing at me. I passed though, so I was happy to laugh along, while dying inside. Now I have the real fear of hitting those mini concrete barriers when I park. Yeah, I don't know why, but I can never seem to land in the middle ground where, like, sometimes you're a little bit too cautious when pulling into a parking spot, and you got like 4 feet in front of, like, the barrier, and then other times you're a little too confident and you come all the way too close to it. Does an examiner mistake count? Local story, the examiners used to tap their pens on the dashboard to signify when it was time for the emergency stop part of the test. This practice was stopped when, apparently, an examiner absent-mindedly tapped his pen on his clipboard towards the end of one unfortunate soul's test, who misinterpreted this as another emergency stop command. The pen went through the examiner's eye. Wow, there's a lot of story going on with not too many words there. I was T-boned by a lady running a red, and failed. Well hey, maybe you can get extra credit by exchanging insurance information. Not an examiner, but my tester told me something I'll never forget. He was driving with a girl and testing her. Here in Arizona, the examiner is not allowed to say anything that isn't a direction. Of course, this doesn't work if the driver is a little slow. So during the test, she pulls up to a stop sign. She's the first one there, but another car pulls up to the left. She waves them on. Not entirely wrong, but she should have gone first. Not a huge deal. Then it happens again. Mind you, she hasn't moved through the intersection. Rather, another car has approached, stopped, and been waved on. There are now 1 or 2 cars behind her. Eventually there's a large backup of honking traffic and a small trickle of cars crossing the intersection in front of her. She finally turns to the instructor and says, "Why are they all mad at me? I have a red light." And that's the story of how a small point deduction failed someone's driving test. Man, I've been sitting at this stop sign all morning, and the sign will not change to being green. I was finishing my test, and a man was yelling at the proctor. Apparently it was unfair his daughter failed since she can't read English, so she didn't understand what a stop sign meant. No, I'd say that fail is pretty fair. Because even if you are somehow taking an English driving class without being able to speak English, I'm pretty sure that stop signs look about the same everywhere in the world. Not an examiner. In excess of 25 years ago, the RTA office car park in Albury, New South Wales, was where you started your test. There was a stop sign and a solid white line at the exit from the car park. Australian rules makes this a compulsory stop. Neophytes would roll through it, and thus fail before the front wheels hit the actual roadway. You know, there's got to be a lot of instructors that they sit in the car with the student, and then the student is really struggling just to get it started, and the instructor is like, "Please just run this first stop sign so that we can just end the test immediately." Obligatory, not an examiner, but this gem is from my examiner. Said the worst he's ever seen was a girl who thought it would be a good idea to try to outrun a train. He told her to stop. She said no, she's fine. The barrier hit the top of her car and insta-failed after she bottomed out the suspension while speeding. Man, these tests are strict. They'll fail you for anything. I almost hit a woman with a stroller during my test. There was a shadow from a building covering her and the stroller, and sunlight everywhere else. The examiner was surprised and didn't see her herself. I passed. Yeah, I mean, it's just natural selection, I guess. Don't ask me how, but my friend drove up an exit ramp. Hey, I understand. Sometimes that's the most direct way to get going the direction you need to go on the freeway. I was the test taker, rather than the examiner, but I imagine this made the guy's top 3 list. I drove to the DMV and parked really well, even though the lot was really sloped, which made it tricky. Score. The examiner checked the car and got in and asked me to operate the lights and wiper blades. I did so, knocked it out of the park. Examiner asked me to reverse out of the space and merge onto the road to begin the test. I take the parking brake off, put the car in reverse, slowly back out with my front foot on the brake because of the slope. I notice the wheel feels super weird, and it's really hard to turn. I put my muscles into it as adrenaline takes over. Finally out of the spot, I put the car in drive and press the gas. No gas. I try again. No gas. I forgot to turn the engine on. Yeah, I didn't pass. See, there's a pretty basic test you have to pass to get your driver's license, but maybe you could get a super driver's license if you could finish that whole driving course without ever turning the car on. I bet the one with the best answer is no longer here with us. F. Yeah, I guess it could always be worse. The worst mistake was the examiner giving me a license. I passed with literally the lowest grade. He said he was legally obligated to pass me, but that I shouldn't drive. He was right. You know, is it a controversial opinion to say that some people really just should not drive? Like, driving is an actual skill that takes a decent amount of coordination, and yet we expect every single person to get a license. Imagine if we just expected every single person to play an instrument. Like, some people are just not very good with music, so there's no reason to expect that they could play an instrument. So I don't know why we expect everyone to be able to drive. Not an examiner, but over here, a student drove the car into a river with her instructor. Both women died. I still don't understand how that could have happened. Well, it sounds like she's probably not going to get a very good grade on that test. My cousin took a turn too fast in Lake Country and flipped the car completely upside down on his first test. You know, flipping a car is something I've always been curious to try. I mean, obviously, you don't really want to ever do that, but I'd love to have some like beater car that I could do it just for fun, just to see exactly how easy it would be. My cousin finished his driving test by driving into the side of the DMV itself, leaving a huge hole in the wall. He asked his instructor if he would have passed if he didn't hit the wall, and the instructor just shook his head and failed him. Okay, I may have destroyed the entire DMV, but other than that, I'm a pretty good driver. Not awful, but I was definitely embarrassed the whole time. I was nervous on my first test, and when they said, "Start the car and pull out onto the road," I turned on the car, then accidentally turned on the windshield wiper fluid and the wipers on full speed and struggled to turn it off. They laughed it off, but I ended up failing anyway. See, I feel like the thing that most student drivers have the hardest time with is that there are so many tiny little procedures you gotta go through every time you're driving, because as an experienced driver, you don't even think about this stuff like, alright, shut the door, turn the key, put your seatbelt on, put it in drive, use your blinkers, use your windshield wipers. You know, there's so many tiny little things you gotta know. And so for a new driver, they just haven't ingrained the new habits into their brains, so they just tend to miss little things. Okay, not a driving test instructor, but this happened during my test. I had just gotten a little Hyundai as my first car to take my test in, as my mom drove a massive SUV. We hadn't driven it much or anything, but we decided that it would suffice. We had to drive about 45 minutes to the testing facility, as we lived out in the middle of nowhere. So here I am, 16, really nervous, in this new car that we just got, on roads I didn't recognize. My instructor had me drive on an old country road where the speed limit was 55 miles an hour, the fastest I'd ever driven. All was going well until I noticed smoke billowing out of the driver wheel well. My car was on fire. Something had bounced up into my tires and burst into flames. After the whole ordeal was over, the instructor passed me despite not completing the maneuverability part of the exam. Cool thing was that the car was totaled due to the fire, and I ended up getting another, way better, non-exploding vehicle. Let's see, you did pretty well at the stop sign, you did pretty well on the highway. There was that little incident about the car catching fire and blowing up, but I'm in a good mood, so I'm gonna pass you. I passed my third time. I have no idea how good I did, though. The Korean woman who was testing me looked pretty tired. Put her sunglasses down, told me about 2 instructions, then promptly began to doze off during the test. At one point she said, "You know where to go," entirely skipped the freeway portion of my test. I remember after pulling in I said, "Okay, we're here," and she softly muttered, "Thank God." 100% pass, no mistakes. I guarantee she didn't see any of my driving. Well, you managed to safely transport a sleeping person from point A to point B, and in a way that's what driving is all about. Not an examiner. One of my friends had a pretty brutal mistake. We live in Wisconsin, and she took her test on a day where there was a bit of snow. Started the road portion of the test, pulling up to a red light with a pedestrian crossing in the crosswalk. My friend started braking way too late. When she hit the brakes, the wheels just locked up and she slid into the pedestrian, knocking them up onto her hood and breaking the pedestrian's leg. She failed the test 4 more times after that, but now uses the road just like anyone else. I refuse to ever ride in her car. Well, hey, it sounds like you're safer inside of her car than outside of it. Not an examiner, but the day I took my test 17 years ago, I was watching the other tests for tips while waiting in line. One kid just finished his test and hit a parked car pulling back into the lot. Overheard the examiner saying that because he had already signed the test form, the wreck was on the teenager's license and not himself. As if teenagers' insurance rates aren't already ridiculously high. Well, that's gonna do it for horrible driving test stories. You know, I was actually pretty late in getting my driver's license. You know, most of my friends were getting learner's permits at like 15 and a half, but I didn't get my license till I was like past 17. I don't know, I just had no interest in it at the time and I was not a fan of driving. But now I'd say I'm probably the best driver on the road. You know, just like everybody else.